Oh, thanks so much, Earl. I really appreciate that. And thank you guys so much for coming out on this kind of nasty night. And thanks to JCCC and the College Scholars Program for making this talk possible. It's great to be able to talk about my research. Tonight I'm going to be talking about environmental politics and the history of environmental politics. And I'm going to make a distinction between conservation on the one hand and environmentalism on the other hand. And I'm going to develop these terms throughout my talk, but just to give you kind of a sense of what I mean by those things quickly, by conservation, I mean a pretty old movement, something that's at least a century and a half old, that is focused on restoring, preserving particular stretches of land in a very hands-on fashion. And when I say environmentalism, I'm talking about a much newer movement, something that sprung up in the mid to late 60s and early 70s that is much more focused on kind of activism and politics. Let's see. I know when you're separating people into camps, like I kind of am doing with conservation on the one hand and environmentalism on the other, you're simplifying to a certain degree. And as I talk, maybe you'll think of yourself as a little bit of both. That's fine. I think that that's actually a good thing. But I think you'll see as the talk goes on that it's useful to make these distinctions as well. So I'm primarily going to be talking about these concepts through this guy, Aldo Leopold, pictured here in, I think, his early to mid-20s, fishing just outside of Albuquerque. And if you can catch fish in an Oxford shirt with a pipe with perfect hair, I think you're doing pretty well. So if you know Aldo Leopold at all, it's probably because of this book up in the top right corner, a Sand County Almanac. And I'm not actually going to talk very much about a Sand County Almanac tonight. My scholarship is more focused on Leopold's early career, but I am going to talk about it just for a second to kind of give you the story behind it, because it's such a touchstone in 20th century environmental writing, and it is kind of an interesting story that's behind it. So, in 1935, when Leopold was living with his family in Madison, Wisconsin, because he was teaching at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, he and his wife Estella and their 5 kids, they had gotten into archery, and some of them were into bow hunting as well. Leopold made his own bows and arrows, and his wife Estella, that's Aldo there and Estella there and 4 of their 5 kids. Estella was a state champion archer, and they wanted to find a place outside of the city where they could practice archery and stage bow hunting trips from. So Leopold finds this old, worn-out farm about an hour outside of Madison, just outside of the city of Baraboo. And the only structure on this farm is this old chicken coop, about knee-deep in dung inside of it. And over the next couple of months, Leopold, his wife, their 5 kids, they restore what they end up calling the shack, and they make it habitable. This is in 1935. Leopold passes away in 1948. And in that stretch of time, Leopold and his family, sometimes he brings his students there, they go just about every weekend. And every year, in that stretch of time, they're planting roughly 2,000 trees and shrubs so that at the end of a decade, from 1936 to 1946, they've planted more than 30,000 trees and shrubs, transforming the landscape. And one of the reasons that Leopold is doing this is because at this time, he's a scientist. He is a forester, he's a wildlife manager. He has really specific ideas about how land should be treated by people. And so this land that he buys, this farm that he buys, it's also kind of a laboratory for his ideas. And that's what he's doing by planning all these things and trying to kind of restore the landscape. To give you a sense of how this property, the shack and this farm that they've bought, is really a family space, I want to read you this quote from Vivian Horn, who is Leopold's longtime secretary at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. She says, "They loved going to the shack. I used to notice that frequently the children preferred going to the shack to some other activity they had an opportunity to do over the weekend. Their family activities seemed to have more attraction. What was the secret? I didn't know, but it made for a happy and congenial family life. All I know was that this family seemed to think it was a lot of fun to spend a vacation together doing the hardest kind of work. So this isn't Henry David Thoreau by himself by the lake. This is a family space. So Leopold lived from 1887 to 1948. In his lifetime, he published more than 300 articles, many of which were very technical and scientific, appearing in technical and scientific journals. He wrote 2 highly influential books, a Sand County Almanac, which was pitched at a popular audience, and parts of it are deeply philosophical, and an earlier book called Game Management, which is essentially a technical manual on how to manage land to propagate game animals. And that book is the standard in the field of wildlife management for more than 4 decades. So he's extremely influential scientifically, but he's also influential philosophically. So he's known now as both the father of wildlife management and the father of environmental ethics. The argument that I'm making tonight is that Leopold shows the commonalities between conservation and environmentalism. I'm making the argument that he, throughout his life, was a unifier for people who came at things from different perspectives. And one of the reasons that I know that he's a unifier is because I saw him do that in my own family. These are a couple of pictures of me and my dad. I lost my dad last year. Last April, he passed away. It was not a complete surprise, but it was rather sudden. My father and I, we had a lot in common. We had a lot to talk about. Music, books, cooking, fishing. But we also disagreed about a lot of things. We had deep disagreements about politics and about our worldview. We essentially had a 2-decade argument going about politics and the way that we view the world. And sometimes that argument was constructive. And sometimes it, as he said, generated more heat than light. There were not a lot of thinkers and writers who we agreed on, but Leopold was someone who we agreed on. Leopold was someone who kind of showed us what our common interests were. Leopold appealed to my dad's sense of personal responsibility, and he appealed to my sense of how the American economy and American culture can be very bad for the natural world. He united both of our interests in nature, in solitude, in wildlife, and Leopold also has a kind of spare, poetic, and lyrical style that appealed to both of us as well. So one of the reasons that Leopold now, and during his lifetime, was able to unite these different groups is because he was part of many different groups. He was a hunter, he was a scientist, he was a farmer, a landowner, and a lifelong bureaucrat. For most of his life, he worked within government, and he deeply believed that government had a role to play in stewarding the natural world, but because he worked inside government for so long, he knew its limits. So he wasn't always a big fan of government's work in the natural world. He avoided outright advocacy of socialism, but he was deeply critical of capitalism's effects on the natural world. And like I mentioned before, he wrote in kind of the philosophical, ethical realm and in the scientific realm as well, and he kind of unites both of these things. So what I'd like to do next is I'd like to bring in a few quotes from Leopold himself, a wonderful writer, to kind of show these perspectives playing out in his work. So here, in 1947, in an essay that he wrote called The Ecological Conscience, he says, "We have not asked the citizen to assume any real responsibility. We have told him that if he will vote right, obey the law, join some organizations, and practice what conservation is profitable on his own land, that everything will be lovely. The government will do the rest. But no important change in human conduct is ever accomplished without an internal change in our intellectual emphases, our loyalties, our affections, and our convictions." So thoughts like this spoke to my father's interest in personal responsibility and his belief that political problems boil down to problems of character. But of course, Leopold is also the lifelong bureaucrat who does have some faith in government as well. This quote comes from his book Game Management, published in 1933. This one says, 20 centuries of progress, in scare quotes, have brought the average citizen a vote, a national anthem, a Ford, a bank account, and a high opinion of himself, but not the capacity to live in high density without befouling and denuding his environment, nor a conviction that such capacity, rather than such density, is the true test of whether he is civilized. And here we see him wrestling with a deep question that he wrestled with throughout his entire career, which is, how can humans live in a place without spoiling it? And then finally, this is from a Sand County Almanac, which he wrote in 1948. He says, we abuse land because we regard it as a commodity belonging to us. When we see land as a community to which we belong, we may begin to use it with love and respect. So here is someone who certainly believes in the institution of private property, owning property, but he's also critical of what that concept does to us, the idea that we own land rather than we live on land and we are part of a land community, which was an idea that he forwarded in a Sand County Almanac. So I want to say a little bit more about where Leopold fits on this spectrum between conservation and environmentalism. And I think one good way to do that is to show that he kind of sits at a midpoint in time, also in temperament, between Teddy Roosevelt, on one hand, standing in front of what I believe is a fake backdrop of trees, a picture of trees. He was pretty young in this photo. And Rachel Carson on the other side. Teddy Roosevelt, of course, President of the United States. Roosevelt wrote several books, all of which Leopold read in his youth, about outdoorsmanship and hunting. And he believes that preserving open spaces in the country is, open spaces where people can hunt and kind of fend for themselves in the wilderness, is a way of strengthening our national character. He believes that the more people doing these things that he considers to be manly will strengthen the character of the country. He believes that this kind of frontier ethos for fending for yourself is good for everyone, and that as president, it was his patriotic duty to preserve these spaces. Rachel Carson, on the other hand, is famous mostly because of her 1962 book, Silent Spring, which some people credit as not necessarily launching the environmental movement, but playing a very, very strong role in launching that movement. In that book, she makes the argument that chemicals, specifically pesticides, are soaking our waters, our soil, our air, and even our bodies. She makes a very strong case, and she is the primary reason why DDT was banned. DDT, the chemical that used to be sprayed, in her words, indiscriminately from the skies to get rid of mosquitoes. She had a hand in getting that banned. Indirectly, she is responsible for the establishment of the Environmental Protection Agency in 1970. Okay, so Leopold kind of unites these different perspectives. He's a scientist. He's one of the first people to bring really solid scientific credibility to the conservation movement. But he always has his roots in wilderness and hunting. A little bit more about conservation and environmentalism. Environmentalism arose at the tail end of the post-war boom in this country. 1945 to 1965, there's an economic boom, there's a boom in technology, there's a population boom, creating a set of problems, environmental problems, that conservation was not ready to handle. Things like air pollution, water pollution, nuclear waste, energy use, energy production, and later ozone depletion and climate change. Conservation wasn't ready to handle these issues. Also, conservation at the time tended to be largely white and male, and it wasn't ready to absorb the lessons of the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s. Whereas environmentalism comes up as a much more diverse movement with a more global perspective and is eager to put into practice some of the tactics and strategies of the civil rights movement. One really useful way, I think, of talking about this movement that happens from conservation to environmentalism being kind of the primary way we talk about nature in this country was put out there by the great conservation writer Kurt Meiney, who also wrote the definitive biography of Leopold. And he talks about it in terms of what we gained in the transition from conservation to environmentalism and what we lost. He says we gained a deep critique of how our economy and culture affects the natural world. We gained a more diverse movement. And we gained a much more global perspective. But what we lost in this transition was an attitude of stewardship, right? An attitude of hands-on stewardship. We lost a respect for the realities of rural life. And we lost the word itself. Conservation denotes action that you take, something that you're doing. Whereas the environment is much more vague, and some would say kind of useless in some ways. So, back to Leopold. The argument that I'm making is that he is a unifier, both for better and for worse. There are good things that come of this, there are bad things that come of this too. And I'm going to be talking specifically about 2 times that he did this. 2 times that he brought together these kind of disparate groups who might have even been hostile to each other and united them towards a common purpose. The first story that I'm going to tell you is set in New Mexico, where he started his career, also where I did my graduate work. It's a place that's close to my heart. And this is a story that shows his gifts as a unifier, but also shows some of the kind of darker roots of environmentalism and conservation. And then in the Midwest, where he helped launch the field of wildlife management. Okay, so first, Leopold in the Southwest. He was there from 1909 to 1924. In 1909, he got his master's in forestry from the Yale School of Forestry. So he's 22 years old, first real job. That same year, he gets his first posting as a ranger in the US Forest Service, first in Arizona, and then he moves to New Mexico. Now at this time, in 1909, these are US territories. Arizona and New Mexico don't gain statehood until 1912. From 1915 to 1924, in New Mexico, Leopold successfully unites all of these disparate groups around this enormous, very diverse state towards the common purpose of wildlife conservation. This is something that other people had tried, but nobody had succeeded at it, but Leopold succeeded. There are all of these different, what were called game protective associations around the state, GPAs. And they weren't friendly with each other, but Leopold succeeded in uniting them. My argument is that he succeeds in this very worthy goal of bringing these groups together towards wildlife conservation. But one of the reasons he succeeds is because he participates in the scapegoating of Apache, Navajo, and Pueblo Indians who were blamed for the decimation of wildlife in the area. These are groups that had been living there for centuries. Wildlife had existed there for centuries alongside them. Anglo settlers started coming en masse in the mid to late 19th century, and that's when wildlife die-off becomes much more of a problem, but then they are blaming the people who had lived there for centuries. And unfortunately, Leopold participates in this, and I'm arguing that that's one of the reasons that he succeeds in uniting these different groups. So let's talk a little bit about New Mexico and wildlife in the 1910s. On the right, it's kind of a column of game animals, animals that people hunted, that were either completely gone from the state of New Mexico or mostly gone in the mid-19th and early 20th century. Elk, bighorn sheep, ptarmigan, which is like a little white grouse that likes high elevation and cold weather, marten, which is like a super cute weasel, wolf, and grizzly bear. All these animals are either gone or almost gone. And there's a lot of stuff that goes into that, that causes that. In 1912, New Mexico becomes a state. So that means in the 1910s, it has a very weak state government. It can make hunting laws to keep people from killing off these animals, but it can't enforce them. It doesn't have the infrastructure to enforce them. One of the reasons it doesn't have the infrastructure to support them is because, well, let me do it this way. There are several states, many of them on the East Coast, that have really robust conservation infrastructure. They have a game warden, they have people enforcing game laws, keeping people from poaching animals and killing them illegally. One of the reasons they had that is because they have a large population of sport hunters, recreational hunters with money who are willing to pay into the system by doing things like buying hunting licenses and fishing licenses and that kind of thing. New Mexico, it doesn't have either of those things. It doesn't have a strong state government, and it doesn't have this large population of sport hunters who are willing to spend money. It has a small population of recreational hunters and a large population of subsistence hunters, people who have been hunting there for decades, sometimes centuries, for their livelihood, for their cultural and material needs. There's also a very powerful ranching industry in the state, mostly sheep and cattle. There is what Leopold and his allies derisively called a European system of private game preserves. There are individual people with money or corporations with lots of money who may not even live in the state or in the country, who buy up huge plots of land and enclose it, fence it off, and then it is their private game preserve, which nobody else is allowed on. This is something that happens in other states too, but a much higher percentage of land is enclosed in this way in New Mexico. So none of these groups are fans of the federal government. And Leopold, at this time, is a representative of the federal government. He is a United States Forest Service employee. And what he wants to do is he wants to make US Forest Service land a place where people hunt, where game is propagated, and where US Forest Service agents like himself enforce the state's game laws. Now, normally this is not something that these people would be in favor of, but they are in favor of it, largely because they all blame the native peoples who have been there for a long time, and they know that laws can be selectively enforced strongly against these people and weakly against everybody else. They've seen this happen over the past couple of decades. They are in favor of this system. Okay, so Leopold, he goes around the state, he unites these groups. He goes on a speaking tour starting in 1915, talking to these different game protective associations, and he convinces them to unite under a single game protective association, the NMGPA, New Mexico Game Protective Association. So that's one way he unites them, by going on the speaking tour. Another way is this publication that he creates called the NMGPA Pinecone. This is a publication that he edits and writes most of. It is in publication from 1915 to 1931. There's a circulation of about 1,000 people. Its mission is to advocate for hunting laws and against subsistence hunters, and to keep New Mexico wildlife conservationists on the same page. So this is a cover from an issue of the Pinecone. You can see a cartoon of a tombstone with different species of animals who have died off. Over on the right is the NMGPA logo. Around the circle, it says Game Protective Associations of New Mexico. Prominently featured is a buffalo skull, and behind that are the words, "Remember the buffalo." And of course, the message there is, we killed off this one beautiful species. We don't want to do it to all of these other species. So in the Pinecone, there are kind of subtle digs against the Native Americans in the area, and there are much more kind of overt blaming of the Native Americans in the area for the mass die-off of wildlife. This is one of the more blatant examples. This is from the July 1917 issue of the Pinecone. This is the back page, which you are meant to tack up on your wall as a poster. And I'm going to read to you what the top half of it says. The basic idea here is that the Indian reservation land, this is the argument that this is making, is the place that has handled wildlife conservation the worst. Okay. Mr. Reader, have you ever heard predictions of a gameless continent? Have you possibly smiled at the idea and said something about false alarm? If so, let us point to you that right under your nose are 16 million acres of gameless wilderness, stripped clean of every living thing bigger than a coyote. Leopold always was a good writer. By modern firearms, by disregard of game laws, by lack of progressive public sentiment, this advanced sample of gameless America is the Navajo country. There's a lot going on here historically, so I want to take a moment to read to you a short excerpt of an article that I wrote about the pine cone and these issues. Okay. The pine cone contained some direct attacks on New Mexico's native peoples. A poster on the back page of the July 1917 issue claimed that the Navajo country in northwest New Mexico and northeast Arizona was, quote, an advanced sample of gameless America that was stripped clean of every living thing bigger than a coyote. At the center of the poster is a drawing of a barren landscape behind a large barrel, which you can see there, captioned, "The remnant of wildlife." The barrel is shot through with holes from which torrents of water spill. The most prominent of these is labeled legal slaughter. It is likely that the poster refers to Indian sovereignty as it related to game laws, which created considerable anxiety among conservationists. Hunting rights figured prominently in treaty negotiations between Indian tribes and government officials in the mid-19th century. And in many treaties, tribes maintained the right to hunt as they wished on their own lands as well as on other lands. Several treaties repeated a phrase that gave native peoples the right, quote, to hunt on the unoccupied lands of the United States so long as game may be found thereon. One of the nation's leading wildlife activists at the time was William Temple Hornaday, who was highly influential on Leopold and the pine cone and was the paper's largest single financial backer. Hornaday was incensed at the idea that Indians would not have to follow federal or state game laws. His 1913 book, Our Vanishing Wildlife, which the pine cone recommended as an excellent Christmas gift, makes the argument forcefully. So this is from William Temple Hornaday's Our Vanishing Wildlife in 1913. The Indian should have no game advantages whatever over a white man. He does not own the game of a region any more than he owns its minerals or its water power. He should obey the general game laws just the same as white men. In Africa, as far as possible, the white population wisely prohibits the natives from owning or using firearms, and a good idea it is too. I am glad there is one continent on which the "I'm just as good as you are" nightmare does not curse the whole land. Leopold avoided language like this, but his arguments against a gameless America are part of the same logic. So let's talk about the good and the bad that Leopold did in the Southwest. So the good, he gathers all these disparate groups towards the very worthy cause of conserving wildlife, and he creates a movement with real political muscle. One of their accomplishments was they convinced New Mexico's governor to appoint a real qualified game warden. Up to that point, that had been kind of a soft political appointment, but they helped turn it into a real asset. He also helped the passage and enforcement of hunting laws that made a real difference in wildlife populations in the area. Some not so good things that he did. He leveraged common disdain for Indian hunters among these disparate groups. He helped establish a wilderness model that allowed ranchers to graze their animals on the federal land, but it banished Indians and ended up attracting unsustainable numbers of recreational hunters. Leopold had a hand in defining New Mexico as a tourist destination for hunters, which was great for the state financially, but in the long term set up kind of an unsustainable situation for the animals there and for the hunters there as well. So why does this matter? It shows that environmentalism and conservation have a shared past and not all of it is good. It also shows that environmentalism's roots are largely in hunting. Many people who are self-styled environmentalists also dislike hunting and hunters. But the roots of their movement is in hunting. And that's something that I think more people should know. And it shows Leopold's talent for uniting people, but that it kind of cuts both ways. So that's Leopold in the Southwest. Let's talk about Leopold in the Midwest. Leopold lived in the Southwest, right, from 1909 to 1924. In 1924, he moves his family from Albuquerque to Madison, Wisconsin. And the reason that he moves is because he gets this new job at the Forest Products Laboratory, which is an office of the US Forest Service that does experiments on wood and other things that forests produce to see how they can make forests pay. Leopold wants this job because he wants a national profile. He also has 5 kids. He needs more money. The idea is that he's going to move to this office, and the guy who is currently running the office, it is rumored that he is going to retire soon. I think you see where this is going. This man does not retire. Leopold is in this job that he didn't relish. He loved his job in New Mexico because it gave him a lot of freedom. He was outside a lot. He traveled around the state. This new job is a desk job. He feels confined. Right around this same time, more people around the country are starting to notice that all the wildlife is dying off, and some people are getting very nervous about that. An example of some people that are getting nervous about that are the people who make firearms and ammunition, because most of the people who buy their products are hunters, and if there's nothing to hunt, you're going to sell a lot fewer guns and ammo. So this industry group, the Sporting Arms and Ammunition Manufacturers Institute, or SAMI, they get the idea that they want to sponsor a national game survey. This has never been done before. So that someone or some group of someones will go around the country and figure out, like, how many game animals are left and what can we do to make sure that there are more. It was very common for individual states to have game surveys, but a national one had never been done. A regional one had never been done. So they approach Leopold in 1928. They say, hey, we want to do a national game survey. Would you like to do that? And he says, hell yes, I don't love my job right now. Okay, so for the first time in his life, he leaves the public sector, government work, and he goes to work for a private company. Now, a little bit of context, in 1928, when he's making this move, there is no infrastructure for wildlife conservation in this country, right? There's a US Department of Forestry. There is an academic discipline of forestry. We're pretty good at propagating trees, but we're not so good at propagating and sustaining wildlife. That changed shortly after Leopold started doing this stuff, and it wasn't solely because of Leopold, but he had a very strong hand in it. So by 1937, the Journal of Wildlife Management, an academic scientific publication, that journal starts publishing. That was a new thing. In 1937, also, the Pittman-Robertson Act was passed, allocating funds for wildlife research and wildlife management. And in 1940, the US Fish and Wildlife Service come about. But in 1928, when Leopold is agreeing to do this survey, none of this stuff exists. So he does the survey, and the result of it is his first book, The Report on a Game Survey of the North Central States. And it's the North Central States and not the entire US, because as soon as he starts this project, he and SAMI, the sponsoring organization, they find out that a national scope is way too large. So he scales down and just does the 8 states of the northern Midwest. And what he's looking to find out in this survey are kind of the on-the-ground conditions of game animals, wildlife. He's looking for game populations, like how many animals are left and their range, like where are they? The state of academic research on these animals and government conservation efforts, as well as the efforts of private clubs, the effectiveness of hunting laws, where animals are and aren't flourishing. He's trying to find all these things out. People didn't know. Another thing that he's trying to do, he also has kind of a rhetorical purpose that is similar to the purpose that he had in New Mexico, which is to take a bunch of different groups who are all interested in wildlife, but they don't really, they're not connected with each other. So his aim is to connect these groups together. So There's all of these different conservation groups. They're all interested in their own thing. Leopold wants them to join forces for the sake of wildlife conservation. And one of Leopold's biographers, Julianne Lutz-Newton, puts it really well in talking about all of these different groups that existed at the time and Leopold's ambition to unite them. She says, "For sportsmen and game breeders, the vision of conservation success was game behind every bush. For the forester, success meant more trees than bushes. For the fisherman, perpetually heavy nets and a fish on every hook. For the nationalist, expanding prosperity and security. For the nature lover, songbirds and wildflowers. For the farmer, abundant well-watered crops and everlasting soil fertility. What Leopold and a few others were beginning to see was how interconnected and interdependent all of these interests and ideals were." All of these different groups, Leopold wants to unite them. One of the reasons that he sees this interconnectedness is because around the same time, the science of ecology is becoming more prominent. Science of ecology, the study of relationships and interconnectedness in the natural world, these are new ideas. Leopold has tapped into them, but many other people aren't. So how do you get people to see their common interests? Leopold is going around to these different states. It's a huge area. He's talking to all different kinds of people. He's talking to farmers and landowners, hunters, researchers and scientists, government conservation workers, state and national congressional lawmakers, all these people he's talking to. He tries to get all of their perspectives into this book that he writes. He goes around to these different states, he writes an individual report for each state, and then he compiles them all together in this single book. So one of the ways he kind of unites their perspectives is he puts all of their perspectives at different places into this book. And I'll give you an example of that. One of the last state reports he did was the Missouri State Report. At the back of that book is a list of people he consulted throughout his research. There are 130 people. 68 of those people, so almost exactly half, are non-professionals. They're not scientists, they're not researchers, they don't do conservation for a living. They're hobbyists, they're hunters, they have other jobs. He makes sure that their perspective is in his report just as much as the perspective of professional conservationists. Another thing that he does is he uses local vernacular. When he's talking about a particular place, he uses the language of that place. For example, he calls weather events by the name that people in those areas use to refer to those weather events. So he might talk about the Cold Friday of 1874 or the Bluebird Storm of 1895. And he explains to everybody else who does not live in that area what that is. But he's kind of giving a wink to the locals, right? Hey, I heard you, I'm speaking your language. Another thing that he does is in a print run of 5,000, he sends 1,600 copies for free to all of the people that he consulted, another way of kind of bringing people into the fold. And there's praise for his book from all over and from many different groups. A publication called the Indiana Farmer's Guide reviews the book, and they say, "Here is a book that is going to attract a vast amount of attention, especially among rural-minded people, because it points the way for farmers to make marginal lands pay returns." A very different group, a very different publication, the journal Ecology, which is written, it's a scientific journal written for ecologists, says, "The report has a great deal of ecological significance and is of much interest to ecologists." Also, hunters, foresters, state government conservation agencies, all of these things, all of these groups have good things to say to Leopold about the report. Not everybody loves it, there's criticism of it, but one thing that he does successfully is he gets all of these different groups to see from kind of one perspective. Okay, so that's Leopold in the Midwest. After Leopold writes the North Central States Report, he's doing that from 1928 to 1931. In 1933, he publishes Game Management, which I talked about at the beginning of the presentation, very influential book. That same year, he's appointed Professor of Wildlife Management at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. It's the first professorship of its kind in the country. In 1935, he purchases the Shack property, as I mentioned earlier. All this time, he's working on this book, A Sand County Almanac. And it's kind of a weird book. He gets rejected from publisher after publisher. But on April 14th, 1948, Oxford University Press, very prestigious academic press, agrees to publish his book. A week later, April 21st, 1948, he's at the shack property with his wife and their youngest daughter. They smell smoke. A brush fire from a neighbor's farm has gotten out of control and is threatening Leopold's land. They get into their truck. They go to the fire. Leopold straps on a tank of water and a pump and goes out into a field to fight the fire. He's out there by himself. He has a heart attack, and he dies. And the fire passes over it. In 1949, in the next year, a Sand County Almanac is published. His son Luna has a great deal to do with this, his eldest son Luna. The book is originally called Great Possessions. That's what it was called, I believe, when it was accepted by Oxford University Press. But Luna and some other people that are working on it, kind of doing the final edits, title it A Sand County Almanac and Sketches Here and There. So I want to close out the presentation by talking a little bit about Leopold's legacy. Right now, on the land that houses the Leopold farm is the Aldo Leopold Foundation. It currently exists, great organization. I've been there a couple of times. First time I went in 2013, I took these pictures. This first picture is of the shack, little house where Leopold and his family would stay when they went to the property. And on the right is the Leopold Legacy Center, which is just about a half a mile from the site of the shack. The Leopold Legacy Center is a very impressive building. You can see solar panels along the top of it. It's a LEED Platinum certified building. You can see the kind of stepped aquifer that, oh, wait a second. There we go. That goes down from the roof, and it leads water down into this garden of native plants. It's built largely of wood, wood and stone. Because it is LEED Platinum certified, that means that, I might not have these numbers exactly right, but all of the materials for the building have to come from within a certain radius, say like a 50-mile radius of the building site. Now, since Leopold and his family transformed this landscape, planted 30,000 trees and bushes in this area, that means that the Leopold Legacy Center is largely made of trees that the Leopold family planted. So the Leopold Foundation, they were established in 1982 by the 5 Leopold children, all of whom, by the way, went on to become successful scientists, academics, and conservationists in their own right. It cares for the original Leopold property and the 600 surrounding acres. It provides space for ongoing ecosystem research on the property, and it offers fellowships for people to come there and study. It maintains strong relationships with the Ho-Chunk tribe, which are the ancestral occupants of the land. Fairly recently, they, in partnership with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, published a little booklet called Why Hunt, which is making the argument that hunting is a sustainable conservationist activity and is specifically aimed at new hunters, trying to bring more people into the fold. And they support rural and urban sustainability initiatives. The theme of their 2016 conference, where I went and presented, and I also saw, I don't know if Deb Williams is here, but she presented there too, gave a great presentation. The theme of that conference was bridging the urban and rural divide, and the keynote speaker was Will Allen of the organization Growing Power, which is based in Milwaukee and Chicago. So in short, the Aldo Leopold Foundation extends Leopold's legacy of pragmatism, working towards solving specific problems, and pluralism, bringing in as many viewpoints as possible in order to solve those problems. Thank you.
We've got time for a few questions. What's a bluebird storm?
It is a storm that caught bluebirds as they were migrating and killed off a huge number of them. Nature's mean.
Do you have anything to do or consulting on the documentary Green Fires?
I did not. I have spoken with both Buddy Huffaker, who is the president of the Leopold Foundation, and Kurt Miney, who was the primary narrator of that film. And I know they're hugely proud of that film. It's a very cool examination of Leopold. So no, I did not have any role in that film, but I have seen it, and I think it's a wonderful film.
What was it called?
It's called Green Fire, and it's kind of a documentary about Leopold's life, but also about the Leopold Foundation and some of the work that they're doing now. Jay?
Right. Ecology, as someone once said, is both a discipline and a T-shirt. Right? And to some degree, Leopold was a person that has now also become a T-shirt. So, based upon, I don't know where you were when you came to Leopold.
I was in New Mexico.
I mean, in terms of the person or the T-shirt, what you knew about Leopold when you began to study him as a scholar. So, I'm curious as to what struck you, and what has struck you the most as sort of a surprise about Leopold that you didn't have any expectation of when you began the research.
So, when you say Leopold as a T-shirt, one of the things that comes to mind for me is actually something that happens in Green Fire, which is a film I like very much, but there is a kind of almost like worship of Leopold, putting him up on a very high pedestal. And there's a good reason for that, right? But almost making him into something that is more than human. And so one of the things that I've wanted to do in my research on Leopold is not so much like look for bad stuff that he did, but like, you know, he was a conservationist in the early 20th century. Like that was a rough time for a lot of people. And so I was kind of interested, like, is that something that he participated in? And so I started doing the research into the pine cone, looking at it in the Leopold archives, and I started to find quite a bit, as I was talking about before. So that was one of the things that surprised me, was the degree to which he participated in this scapegoating of Native Americans in the Southwest. That was one of the biggest surprises for me. Another big surprise for me was how family-oriented he was, and how family-oriented this shack property was. When you read a Sand County Almanac, his family is not prominent, but they are in the background. And the more research that I did, the more I saw, like, you know, what a family man he was, and what a family space the farm was.
Aaron? When you kind of get this picture of how big the issue of environmentalism and conservation is, sometimes it's daunting, and it's like, wow, what, you know, there's so much, you know, and what do I do? Is there anything he indicates, or like a good way to start to help? Anything that he says is like really important?
He says a lot of things. He wrote about this for his entire life. His most famous statement comes in the last essay of that book, A Sand County Almanac. It's called A Land Ethic. It's very much geared towards landowners, hunters, those kinds of people. It's more about an attitude towards, and maybe this is part of what's been turned into a T-shirt, it's more about an attitude of seeing yourself as part of a community as opposed to like a conqueror of nature, which is something that we kind of naturally do, I think. But as far as like what can we do, I think that's a natural question that always comes up in a forum like this, for good reason, partly because of, as you said, it's such a big issue. Like, you want to know like how you can help. My maybe somewhat unsatisfying answer is everybody has to figure that out for themselves. I'll use myself as an example. I'm not a particularly good environmentalist. But one of the ways that I think I can help is I'm an English professor. I teach writing and literature classes. I think one of the big reasons that we are in the bind that we're in is we have stopped respecting and listening to scientists as a culture. We have become susceptible to very bad information, which is something we talked about a lot in our class, right? And so one of the things that I try to do in my classes is I try to talk with students about how to find good information and how to differentiate between good information and bad information. Maybe that's not something that everybody would associate naturally with environmentalism, but I've looked at, where my niche is, and I feel like that's something that I can do. And I think that that's something that everybody can do. Like, where am I? What's the work that I'm doing? What am I good at? And how can I help in this little spot where I'm in?
Thank you.
It's my understanding that the environmentalists tend to occupy one side of politics and the conservationists tend to occupy another side of politics. One thing I'm curious about is there's a problem with the inheritance tax on large quantities of land that are being used for conservation, in that when it's passed down, the taxes can sometimes be too much to pay for a family who doesn't have a lot of money but has a lot of inheritance on the land. What would Leopold have thought about inheritance taxes for quantities of land like that?
Those what would Leopold have thought questions are always a little tricky. Leopold, as I tried to talk about a little bit, as somebody who worked in government for a huge portion of his life, he believed that government had a strong but distanced role to play in supporting stewardship of land. But one of those distanced roles is to make sure that the government is getting enough money from taxes to support conservation efforts. I don't know a lot about the inheritance tax, I'll admit. But I do know that over the past decade, and especially over the past couple of years, a lot of money, federal government money, has been moved out of stewardship. So I was actually just reading about this recently. There's a great organization in New Mexico called the Quivira Coalition. And they do lots of sustainability work and conservation work in the Southwest. And one of the problems that they're running into is they have many partnerships with federal agencies like the US Forest Service. And when you have a partnership with a government agency, you can count on that government agency for funding a certain part of that partnership. Well, the amount that the federal agencies are putting into these partnerships is less and less and less. So conservation organizations like the Quivira Association have to pay out more and more and more, and eventually they just have to step back and say, we can't afford to do this anymore. So the trend right now is pulling money away from conservation and away from government agencies that do conservation and making these kind of coalitions and private citizens and non-governmental organizations pay more and more. And especially in the era of global warming, wildfires, all of these serious problems, it's not a good trend for sustainability.
If we stovepipe in between conservationists and environmentalists, and we say conservationist is a hunter, environmentalist is typically a non-hunter, and glad you brought up Pittman Robertson. I live in Missouri, so we've got a little bit different model because we have the sales tax. So everybody that spends money in Missouri is paying into a sales tax that's going towards conservation, whereas the majority of states around the country, their dollars are coming from hunting. So the money that's going into conservation is from the hunter.
Right.
And then that's also coming back double-fold, tri-fold with Pittman Robertson. And do you have any thoughts on how you bridge the gap between the environmentalist and the conservationist, where you have the conservationist saying, hey, I'm fronting all the money through the sales of purchase of different hunting licenses, and it's my money that's being put to work towards conservation, versus the environmentalist, there's no associated taxes on, say a set of binoculars that a bird watcher might get, or a backpack tax, anything like that. So you've kind of got two groups that are...
Yeah, that's a problem, and so that's one of the hazards of Environmentalism being a lot of times a movement that is kind of at a distance from the natural world, whereas maybe they're not as in touch with particular areas of land, but they are very politically motivated to support certain organizations, to advocate for protecting certain species. But then you have people who might be more self-styled conservationists, hunters, saying, but like this is land that I spend time on, and I'm the one putting in this hands-on work, and I'm the one whose money is funding this conservation. I think that's one of the great sources of stress between these two groups. I don't know exactly how to solve it, but I will say that I do think environmentalism needs to get over, to a certain extent, the problems that it has with hunting and hunters. I understand where a lot of those problems come from. But like I said in the presentation, there is a lack of recognition. And I'm drawing a little bit on my own experience from being in Chicago and teaching courses on this kind of stuff and talking with people who consider themselves to be environmentalists, but are very much not in favor of hunting and very much not aware of how the roots of their movement come out of hunting. So I think more awareness about that could help. But I don't know how that happens, I have to admit.
Last question, and we can move downstairs.
Thank you. What was Aldo Leopold's stance on the idea of preservation as opposed to either conservation or stewardship of resources? And environmentalism is basically developing after his death. But then there's that whole concept of preservation.
Right.
Where do you stand on that?
So part of what I hear you saying is talking about this split between preservationism on one side and conservationism on the other, where the conservation mantra is wise use. We set aside these lands for the U.S. Forest Service, but we use the lands. The idea is we use it as much as possible to help as many people for the longest period of time, something along those lines. Whereas preservationism is much more like, let's set these lands aside and just let them be. Like, humans in this place, that's a bad thing for the most part. Leopold changed a lot throughout his lifetime. He had a hand in setting aside one of the first wilderness areas in the country, in New Mexico, in what is now the Gila Wilderness Area. So he did believe in preservationism to an extent, but he also came up in Teddy Roosevelt's U.S. Forest Service, which was very much on the conservation side of things, much more on the wise use side of things. I think he saw value in both, but I think that towards the end of his life, I think where he was however you come to a love of the natural world and land, like that's good enough. I think he got to be less picky about how people came to it and how people found ways to support stewardship. If you're a preservationist, great, let's do that. If you're a conservationist and you think we should have wise use, let's do that. But let's do it. Like, let's talk, let's bring our perspectives together, and let's get this done. In that way, he was very much of a pragmatist. Yeah.
Hey, we've got refreshments downstairs, so let's continue the conversation down there, and thank you very much.
Thank you.